On September 1st, 1943, Rabaul Airfield lay under a pale Pacific sun. Humid air pressed down on the operations tent as Lieutenant Commander Saburo Sakai leaned over the morning intelligence report. He had faced death more than once, lost an eye to American gunners, and shot down more enemy aircraft than most men had ever seen. Yet what he read that day made him laugh. The Americans, the report claimed, had produced a new carrier fighter. Heavy as a bomber, broad as a transport, a slab of metal called the Hellcat. Twice the weight of their cherished Zero. A machine, not a bird. Another American blunder, the briefing concluded. Sakai looked through the open tent flaps at the A6M Zeros lined up on pierced steel planking. Sleek, clean, predators. For 2 years, they had ruled the Pacific skies. British Hurricanes had crumpled, Dutch Buffaloes burned, American P-40s fell like rain into the sea. No enemy fighter had ever broken their rhythm. The thought of a bloated American Hellcat challenging this supremacy seemed like a joke told at the wrong funeral. But beneath that laughter hid a truth no one in the tent wanted to face. Within 30 days, this failure would start dismantling the Imperial Japanese Navy's air arm with surgical precision. For the pilots of 1943, Japanese air power felt inevitable. Since December 7th, 1941, the mathematics of war had been almost obscene. Pearl Harbor, 29 aircraft lost, 347 destroyed. The Philippines, 7 against 103. Over Darwin, 2 for 30. Britain's Far East Fleet humiliated. Dutch defenses swept aside in a week. At the heart of this dominance was a single machine, the Mitsubishi A6M Zero. It was unlike anything the Allies had faced. When captured examples reached American engineers in 1942, they questioned the numbers, certain they were forged. An aircraft with bomber range, biplane agility, and lethal firepower was unthinkable. Pilots described flying it like wearing wings. It obeyed thought rather than control. Light, responsive, and agile in the hands of skilled aces like Hiroyoshi Nishizawa, it was both weapon and art form. The Americans, in comparison, flew trucks, clumsy, overbuilt, slow to react. That was the prevailing wisdom in every Japanese squadron room. This miraculous performance came at a cost. The Zero carried no armor, no self-sealing fuel tanks, and often no radio. Everything that didn't make it lighter was stripped away. Where American engineers built for durability, the Japanese designed for uncompromised flight. It was an elegant blade forged for quick kills, not prolonged survival. And then came the Hellcat reports. In early 1943, through neutral Swedish channels, Japanese intelligence picked up specifications that seemed absurd. A 12,000-pound fighter powered by a draggy radial engine, with armor plate wrapped around the cockpit, bulletproof glass, self-sealing tanks, and 2,400 rounds of ammunition. A war machine, not a dancer. Minoru Genda, the tactical architect of Pearl Harbor, studied those figures at Combined Fleet Headquarters. His verdict was confident and swift. Another failure. We will fly circles around it. His numbers made sense. The Zero's wing loading meant it could turn in a tight radius. The Hellcat's heavier loading meant wide, slow turns. In the only kind of aerial fight the Japanese had ever trained for, turning dogfight, the Hellcat should have been helpless, and that was the fatal miscalculation. The Japanese believed their dominance was aerodynamic. In truth, it was circumstantial, born of surprise, pilot quality, and early Allied weakness. They had crafted an exquisite blade, but never considered what would happen when the enemy brought an industrial hammer to the fight. By late 1943, cracks were already forming beneath the surface. The Zero's lightweight structure couldn't absorb punishment. Its pilots were aging, exhausted. Its engine, designed for earlier altitudes, was straining to keep up with evolving battle conditions. But no one inside the system could admit it. Pride in the Zero wasn't just technical. It was cultural. It was the symbol of a nation that had defied the West and shattered colonial air forces. It had turned pilots into living legends. Admitting it was obsolete was like questioning the emperor himself. The Americans, meanwhile, weren't designing a dueling partner. They were building a system. The Hellcat wasn't meant to turn faster. It was meant to never have to turn at all. As Sakai closed the folder that morning, laughter still in his throat, the blueprint of his world was already breaking. In a few short weeks, that heavy, ugly machine would climb into the Pacific sky and rewrite the mathematics of air supremacy. The pilots of the Zero would still fight with skill, courage, and fire. But from this moment on, they would be fighting history itself. September 30th, 1943. Marcus Island. Petty Officer First Class. Yoshio Fukui squinted against the sunlight as the deep blue horizon shifted. What he saw at first looked like bombers, fat silhouettes climbing from the southeast, moving without elegance. But as they turned toward him, the shape became unmistakable. Broad fuselage, thick wings, blunt-nosed power. This wasn't a torpedo plane. It was something else. He and his wingman rolled their Zeros into a familiar diving turn, the maneuver drilled into them from their earliest training. The heavy American aircraft would stay level, predictable. The Zero would scythe around like a sword and slip onto its 6 o'clock before the enemy even knew what was happening. It had worked against P-40s. It had worked against Wildcats. It always worked, but this time the world broke its rhythm. The American didn't turn. It went straight up. The Hellcat's engine roared with a kind of mechanical confidence Fukui had never heard before. 2,000 horsepower dragged its bulk into the sky at an angle no Zero could match. Fukui tried to follow. His engine screamed, his airspeed bled away, his control softened. Gravity wrapped around him like lead. Above him, the Hellcat flipped into a perfect hammerhead and fell like a predator. It locked onto him, 6 heavy machine guns erupting. 17 rounds punched through his aircraft in 3 seconds. Fukui survived only by forcing his Zero into a spin, tumbling toward the ocean with a shredded wing. His wingman didn't come back. The reconnaissance plane they were escorting vanished in a flash of tracer fire. For the first time, the Imperial Navy had met the Hellcat, and it had drawn first blood. Just 5 days later, October 5th, over Wake Island, another formation of Zeros soared to meet what they believed was another routine raid. 12 Hellcats approached in neat formation. The Japanese held every textbook advantage: altitude, position, surprise. The Zeros dove. But the Hellcats didn't scatter. They didn't flinch. They absorbed the opening salvo through thick armor, plate shielding the pilot, steel around the oil system, self-sealing fuel tanks swallowing fire. Then they climbed, their weight turning into speed, dragging the fight upward to altitudes where the Zero gasped for air. At 25,000 feet, the Hellcat still had over 2,600 horsepower. The Zero had barely 900. The fight was over before it began. They came down on us like hawks on sparrows, one surviving pilot would later write. We fired. They climbed away, we turned. They fell on us again. 8 Zeros fell from the sky. No Hellcats were lost. In November, back at Rabaul, the laughter was gone from the briefing room. Veteran Ace Lieutenant Commander Tanamizu, one of the few men to have faced the new fighter more than once and lived, stood before the assembled pilots of the 204th Air Group. "Forget everything you know about air combat," he said. The room was silent. "The Americans have changed the fight. They don't duel anymore. They execute." Tanamizu explained what most pilots were only beginning to grasp. The Hellcat wasn't built to dance, it was built to control the battle space. Its doctrine was something new to Japanese eyes: energy fighting. Maintain speed. Maintain altitude. Attack from above. Never let the enemy use their turn advantage. Hit and climb. Hit and climb again. Where Japanese squadrons flew like lone samurai, Hellcat formations operated like a machine. 2 ships working in harmony, one drawing the enemy's eye, the other dropping down like a guillotine. Their radios, once mocked as unnecessary weight, were what made it lethal. Fukui and others had felt that invisible coordination. Now Tanamizu gave it words. "They are not just pilots," he said. "They are parts of something larger. You fight one Hellcat, but you face the entire machine behind it." In the months ahead, Japanese pilots would keep flying with courage. Their Zeros would still roll and twist through Pacific skies with the grace of blades. But those blades were now striking at steel, and the steel was learning faster. What began as one encounter over Marcus Island was the turning of the tactical tide. The moment the old way of fighting began to die. December 1943. Truk Lagoon. Commander Mitsuo Fuchida, once the man who led the attack on Pearl Harbor, walked slowly through the flight line, staring at the wrecks of aircraft that had barely made it home. Their wings were shredded. Their fuselages were torn through like paper. The ground crews were silent. They didn't need words to explain what had happened. The enemy had changed. The Hellcat's firepower was something no Zero had ever been built to endure. 6 Browning M2 machine guns, each spitting 750 rounds a minute, threw a wall of heavy, fast metal into the sky. In a single second, a Hellcat could pour more destructive energy into the air than a Zero could in half a minute. Its bullets were heavier, faster, and they didn't need lucky hits. They punched through light frames and fuel tanks like they weren't even there. In Fuchida's hand was a report from one of the last returning pilots. The man had never seen the enemy. Radar had seen him first. While Japanese pilots still depended on human eyes, Hellcat squadrons were guided by shipborne radar that tracked incoming formations from 50 miles away. When Japanese formations broke through clouds, the Americans were already positioned, above, behind, waiting. Lieutenant Sadamu Komachi had written simply, "We never saw them. They saw everything." For pilots trained to dominate through maneuver, it was like fighting blindfolded against someone who could see in the dark. In early 1944, the Industrial War reached the cockpit. For years, the Imperial Navy had prided itself on the most rigorous pilot training in the world. It was an art form. 3 years of flight instruction, aerobatics, gunnery, formation discipline, and the spiritual philosophy of air combat. A naval aviator graduated with 700 hours of flight time, a swordmaster of the air. But the tide of war doesn't care about art. By 1944, Japan was running out of fuel, aircraft, and most painfully, time. Pilot training was slashed from years to months. New aviators reached the front with 200 to 300 hours at most, many less. Ammunition shortages meant they practiced gunnery with 50 rounds total. Entire skills like night flying and radio discipline were simply cut. Ensign Yamamoto, a fresh recruit, was emblematic of this collapse. When he arrived at the front, he had never fired his guns in the air. He had never flown in the dark. 7 minutes after his first combat mission began, his Zero was gone. The Americans, by contrast, were doing something entirely different. Their pilots arrived on the deck with at least 300 flight hours, including dozens in the very aircraft they would fight in. They practiced energy tactics in safe skies over Texas, landing on simulated carrier decks until it became muscle memory. They drilled together, spoke to each other, fought as a unit. When a Hellcat squadron met a Japanese formation in the air, the difference wasn't just in aircraft. It was in the people inside them. The Zero had once been invincible because the men who flew it were masters. Now they were being replaced by boys with no real chance. The Hellcat pilots, meanwhile, were professionals trained on an assembly line of precision and consistency that mirrored the way their planes were built. The Zero was an artisan's blade. The Hellcat was the product of an industrial machine, and unlike the Japanese system, the American machine was built to scale. It could lose pilots and replace them without shattering its tactical structure. For Japan, every veteran lost was a hole that could not be filled. In war, technology is never just steel and fuel. It's the system behind it, the training, the doctrine, the logistics. By the beginning of 1944, Japan wasn't just outgunned. It was outsystemed. What started as tactical shock over Marcus and Wake Island was now becoming structural collapse. The enemy didn't just have a better aircraft. They had built a better way to fight. October 1944. Formosa. The night sky above the island was clear. From the control tower, the ground crews of the 201st Naval Air Group watched streaks of fire carve their way across the stars. They thought it was flak at first, then realized it was the burning trails of their own aircraft. The battle had lasted less than 30 minutes. It had begun before they even saw the enemy. American task forces had moved with breathtaking precision. Radar aboard carriers detected the Japanese approach at 100 miles. Fighters launched, climbed into position, and waited. By the time the first Japanese formation appeared on radar screens at Formosa, more than 250 Hellcats were already in the air. What followed was not a dogfight. It was an execution. The Japanese pilots charged forward in tight groups, still fighting as their instructors had taught them years before. Close, aggressive, determined to meet their enemy face to face. The Hellcats never gave them the chance. From higher altitude, they dropped like hawks, firing once, climbing away, never lingering long enough for a Zero to turn the tables. It was the same story across the Pacific skies. Altitude advantage, radar coordination, and overwhelming numbers. Every time I turned, they were already behind me. One surviving pilot wrote in his log, "We never fought them. We were hunted. 8 months earlier over the Marianas, that hunting had reached industrial scale. June 19th, 1944, the day American pilots would call the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. The Japanese Navy had staked everything on this battle. Hundreds of aircraft were launched in waves to destroy the American invasion fleet. It was a desperate gamble to turn back the clock, to prove that the spirit of the Zero could still defeat the machines. But by the end of the day, the Pacific told a different story. Hellcats formed layered defensive screens. Pilots, guided by radar controllers aboard their carriers, met Japanese formations far from the fleet. Veteran and rookie alike, they cut through the attacking waves with clinical efficiency. The Zeros tried to turn. The Hellcats refused. In less than 10 hours of combat, over 300 Japanese aircraft were destroyed. American losses? 29. Those numbers weren't a statistic. They were a funeral bell. In the midst of that aerial storm, one pilot etched himself into legend. Commander David McCampbell, flying his Hellcat over Leyte Gulf later that year, intercepted a formation of Japanese planes alone. Calmly, methodically, he shot down 9 in a single sortie, 7 before the rest of his squadron even arrived. He returned with bullets still in the belt. For Japanese pilots, the name McCampbell became a shadow. It wasn't just his skill. It was what he represented, a new kind of warfare, where one man in a machine built by thousands could bring down an entire formation. And then came the psychological collapse. Pilots returning from the front no longer spoke of glorious combat. They spoke of being ambushed by an enemy they couldn't see, of tracer lines from nowhere, of Hellcats hanging above them like a weight in the sky, waiting to fall. The once proud Zero veterans began calling it the Iron Wall. It was as if the Americans had built an invisible fortress in the air, and every time they charged, they broke against it. By the end of 1944, even the bravest began to doubt. The Japanese air arm wasn't just losing aircraft, it was losing belief. The tide that had begun with laughter in Rabaul was now irreversible. The Hellcat had stripped away not just the tactical advantage, but the psychological armor of the Zero. From here on, every battle would be fought under the shadow of inevitability. Spring 1945. The waters off Okinawa boiled with fire. American task forces surrounded the island in a steel ring, their carriers launching waves of aircraft without pause. For the Japanese, this was the final gate, the last line before the home islands. And into that gate, they sent everything they had left. The world called it Operation Iceberg. The Japanese called it survival. Nearly 2,000 kamikaze sorties rose into the air, desperate to break through the Hellcat umbrella that protected the fleet. The strategy was brutal and simple. If they couldn't win in combat, they would turn their planes into weapons. But the Hellcats were ready. Radar picked up the kamikazes before they ever saw the fleet. Controllers vectored the fighters into position. The first attacks were met at altitude, where Hellcats cut through them with deadly precision. Lieutenant Eugene Valencia led one of the most feared formations in the Pacific, the Flying Circus. 4 Hellcats, wingtip to wingtip, sweeping through Japanese formations in coordinated high-speed passes. We called it the mowing machine, Valencia later said. Each man had a sector. We'd sweep through, climb, and do it again. They never reached the ships. The numbers told the story. 38,000 sorties flown. Over 2,300 enemy aircraft destroyed. Only a fraction of kamikazes ever made it through. The Hellcat wasn't just winning air battles anymore. It was preventing disaster. But behind those numbers lay something deeper, a technological chasm that Japan could no longer cross. The latest Hellcats carried water-injected engines producing over 2,200 horsepower. Their armor was thicker. Their gun sights were computing devices that calculated where to aim even before a pilot finished moving the stick. American pilots were flying machines that did the math for them. By contrast, Japanese Zeros were being held together with spare parts. Factories had been bombed. Resources were gone. Radios often didn't work. Instruments failed in flight, and the young men flying them were barely trained. Saburo Sakai, Japan's most famous surviving ace, encountered a late-war Hellcat and threw everything he had into the fight. Loops, rolls, every trick from 200 combats. The Hellcat followed easily, he would write years later, almost casually. I survived because the pilot forgot to drop his tank. That was my only advantage. His mistake. The human cost was unbearable. By war's end, the Hellcat would destroy 5,223 aircraft in aerial combat for the loss of only 270 of its own. It would produce more than 300 American aces. It would account for 3/4 of all Navy air victories. And on the other side, 18,000 Japanese naval aviators had begun the war. Fewer than 100 experienced pilots survived. The rest were gone, burned, drowned, or erased from the sky in seconds of gunfire. When Vice Admiral Takejiro Onishi approved the kamikaze strategy, it wasn't out of madness. It was mathematics. If a Zero attacks a carrier conventionally, he said, it dies. If it becomes a bomb, it has a 30% chance to strike. The pilots would die either way. One way, their death meant nothing. The other, it could at least leave a mark. It was a choice born from defeat. October 25, 1944, marked the first official kamikaze mission. Hiroyoshi Nishizawa, Japan's ace of aces, scored 2 Hellcat kills that day, numbers that would echo through propaganda broadcasts. The next day, flying as a passenger, he was shot down by Hellcats. Japan's greatest sword had been broken in transit, powerless before the machine. In the final months, the Japanese pilots weren't fighting for victory. They were fighting to be remembered. The Hellcat had taken away every advantage except their will to die, and even that wasn't enough. Covers, occupation revelation, engineering post-mortem, production miracle, strategic revolution, cultural collision, judgment of history. Word target 900, the character target, no spaces, born 4700 September 1945, Atsugi Airfield. The war was over. The sun still rose over the airfield, but the banners of the rising sun no longer flew. Lined up on the runway were the men who had once laughed at the Hellcat. Pilots, mechanics, ground crews, the fragments of a force that had once dominated the Pacific. They stood in silence as 12 F6F Hellcats from USS Yorktown approached to land. The engines roared overhead. The same sound that had haunted them over Marcus Island. Wake the Marianas, Leyte Gulf, Okinawa. Lieutenant Robert Vause, an American ace with 19 victories, climbed out of his Hellcat, smiled politely at the crowd, and climbed back in to give a demonstration. He rolled, looped, climbed into the clouds, dove again, and pulled up in a clean vertical maneuver that would have torn a Zero apart. Through the interpreter, he told the stunned Japanese pilots, "This isn't even pushing it. In combat, with water injection, it's stronger. It's built to take anything." The machine that had defeated them now danced above their heads, elegant and effortless. In the following weeks, Japanese engineers were given access to captured Hellcats for post-war study. They opened the cowling and stared into an industrial reality they had never matched. The Pratt & Whitney R2800 engine contained nearly 2,800 precisely machined parts. Each one was interchangeable with the same part from any other engine of the same model. An entire squadron could strip down engines, swap parts, and have them flying again within hours. The Nakajima Sakai engine of the Zero? Each was hand-fitted. No two were identical. Maintenance was an act of craftsmanship. The Hellcat was an act of engineering. Professor Jiro Horikoshi, the man who had designed the Zero, stood before one of those engines after the war and simply said, "We built for 1941. They built for 1945. Beyond the engineering lay something even more devastating: production. At the Grumman plant in Bethpage, New York, a Hellcat had rolled off the assembly line every 60 minutes at peak. Over 12,000 built in just 30 months. In that same period, Japan produced fewer than half that number of fighters, of every kind combined. Grumman's system was color-coded, layered, and relentless. Shifts ran day and night. Quality stayed high. Each Hellcat represented not just an airplane, but the weight of a continent's industry. The Zero was built like a sword in a forge. The Hellcat was built like bullets from a factory. This flood of machines didn't just win battles, it rewrote naval warfare itself. Before the Hellcat, carriers were fast but fragile. Doctrine demanded striking first to survive. But by 1944, American admirals no longer worried about being found. They let the enemy come. "Let them come," Admiral Mark Mitcher said. "The Hellcat will destroy them at our convenience." Carriers became floating fortresses. Air groups became defensive shields and offensive weapons at once. The Pacific became an American sea. Yet beneath the steel and strategy was a deeper story, a collision of philosophies. Japan had built its war machine on Bushido, individual skill, spiritual strength, the belief that the warrior's soul could overcome material odds. America had built its war machine on systems, logistics, machines, communications, radar, standardization. The Hellcat was not just an aircraft. It was the embodiment of an entire civilization's way of making war. The Zero fought with elegance. The Hellcat fought with inevitability. In 1962, 2 decades after the war, American and Japanese veterans met at a symposium. Commander Saburo Sakai, the ace who once dismissed the Hellcat as a failure, stood across from David McCampbell. The Navy's top ace, McCampbell spoke first. The Hellcat won the Pacific Air War, period. Sakai nodded. He didn't argue. The Zero was a better fighter, he said. The Hellcat was a better weapon system. We brought swords to a gunfight and wondered why we lost. The numbers are cold. But they tell the truth. 23 enemy aircraft destroyed, 70 sunken. Hellcats lost in air combat 19 to 1 kill ratio 12,275. Hellcats produced fewer than 100 experienced. Japanese naval pilots left by 1945 in the end. The pilots who had once laughed at the Hellcat lived at their enemy's discretion. And that, as Sakai said before his death in 2000, was the ultimate defeat. We thought we were samurai. The Hellcat showed us we were just men with outdated weapons facing the future. The Hellcat didn't just end the Zero. It ended an era. History doesn't end when the guns fall silent. It lingers, in steel and doctrine, in the quiet way nations prepare for the next war. The F6F Hellcat was never just another fighter. It was the moment when industrial power, technology, and strategy fused into one machine. When Japan surrendered in 1945, the Zero became a relic. The Hellcat became a blueprint. In the years that followed, air forces around the world studied the Hellcat's campaign like scripture. Its success wasn't rooted in a single pilot's skill or a miraculous design breakthrough. It came from something larger, a system that worked together with ruthless precision. Radar spoke to the carriers. Carriers spoke to the fighters. Factories spoke to the front line, and the Hellcat listened. The lessons of the Hellcat era spread quickly. In the early Cold War, new fighters were born not in small workshops but in sprawling assembly lines. Standardization replaced improvisation. Pilots trained as teams, not lone duelists. The Hellcat's layered defense concept became the foundation of post-war air defense doctrine. Jet interceptors, radar pickets, AWACS, all of it grew from the idea that air superiority wasn't a duel, but a network. By the 1950s, aircraft like the F-86 Sabre and MiG-15 carried that philosophy into a new sky. In those jets, you could still hear an echo of the Hellcat, not in shape, but in purpose. For the pilots who had flown it, the Hellcat remained more than a machine. It was a partner, rugged, forgiving, built to bring its crew home. Many said they owed their lives not to luck, but to Grumman's engineers. Lieutenant Eugene Valencia, one of the top-scoring Hellcat aces, would later say, "The Hellcat didn't make you great. It made you better." Unlike the Zero, fragile and lethal, the Hellcat could take punishment and keep flying. It gave ordinary men the chance to do extraordinary things. In Japan, the memory was different. The Hellcat was remembered not with hatred, but with a kind of grim respect. Saburo Sakai, who once faced it alone in the skies over the Marianas, spent decades after the war speaking to American veterans. He never forgot how quickly laughter turned to letters home. "We thought we could outfly them," he said late in life. "But you can't outfly a machine that doesn't fight alone." The Hellcat's industrial legacy also shaped how America fought wars. It proved that control of the skies didn't belong to the best pilot. It belonged to the nation that could train thousands, build thousands, and connect them with invisible threads of information. That idea became the backbone of every major conflict that followed. Korea's air corridors, Vietnam's air superiority campaigns, Desert Storm's air dominance. Every satellite-guided jet, every radar intercept, every precision strike owes something to a heavy, ugly fighter from 1943 that was never supposed to work. In museums today, Hellcats sit silent under polished lights, their wings folded tight, their blue paint faded. Visitors walk past them with quiet curiosity, not realizing that in those engines and rivets lies the turning point of a war. The Zero embodied the past. The Hellcat invented the future. The day it first took off, it was underestimated. The day the war ended, it was unmatched. And long after the war, its echoes still fly in every sky.